going to tell you about why I'm passionate about pipeline safety management systems and one of my earliest memories. Oh, I need to click on this. Thank you. So I grew up with a cousin that survived a catastrophic accident. When I was 3, I was at a family event, and we were, my cousins and I had an 8-year-old cousin, JJ, my cousin Jason was 5, and I was 3, and I was really excited because my aunt and my uncle raced BMX dirt motorcycles, and they were going to go to the race, and my other aunt was offering to take all my cousins and I to the race, and I got to go with the big kids. So we get to the race, and it was, early on we were warned. There was a fence sort of similar to that snow fence that was the only fence at the track. And we were warned it was a memorial race and not to get too close to the fence. And it was a very hot summer day, and I remember my big, strong cousin, JJ, he was in charge of me at this event, and he took me around this event, and he had me by the hand, and we were what we felt like wasn't too close to the fence, and that was when we heard and saw the roar of the bike coming towards us. And the next thing I know, I felt like I was pushed aside, and my cousin was on the ground, and he wasn't moving, and his head was cracked open, and basically the force of the bike had pushed him into a parked car, and that was what split his skull open that day. There was only 4 foot between the plastic snow fence and where the end of the track was. As you can see, that's a picture of him before the accident, and after the accident, he was left permanently brain damaged. So I grew up watching him learn how to walk and how to talk again. Oops, wrong way. So there was 3 things that I learned from that day, and that have greatly influenced me in my life. Danger can come seemingly out of nowhere at you, and the improbable does happen to someone. And 2, that the personal consequences of this type of injury, they don't just last that day. It changes the fabric of that family's life forever. And it's not just the injured person, it's the caregiver, it's the mom, the dad, it's the siblings. It really isn't just a one-time thing. It changes them forever. And 3, that these types of accidents are preventable. And typically, it's not just one thing that goes wrong that causes the accident. There's several things that happen in order for that accident to occur. And these are typically low frequency but high consequence type of events. So back to my story that day, we were there, and we were waiting at the hospital for what seemed to be hours before my cousins and I were in the parking lot because we were too little to be in there with my other aunt. And we waited for what seemed to be hours, and they took us up to the hospital room. And I believe that was because they weren't sure my cousin was going to make it, and they wanted to make sure that my other cousin, who was his little brother, had a chance to say goodbye before they airlifted him out. And so we had that opportunity. And by the evening, by the time we actually got home, it was quite late in the day. And all of the chaos, this was well before cell phones. There really wasn't a whole lot of information that had been relayed to my parents or anyone that wasn't there, because they were switching hospitals, and we were in the middle of rural Iowa. So you're going from a very small town hospital to a much larger town, and my cousin was airlifted. And really, it wasn't until I got home that my parents and my aunts and uncles and grandma saw how close to that danger the rest of us were. Because it wasn't until I got home that day that the blood that hit me from my cousin was cleaned up. So I grew up, and I loved math and science and solving problems. So there's a tie in here to to natural gas and pipeline safety management systems, I swear. And so I became a chemical engineer. And I've had the privilege of working in several different industries. And I've been really fortunate to find my calling in my current role as performance improvement manager of implementing pipeline safety management systems. And I really feel that this is the most important role and effort that I will ever work on in my career. And the efforts that what this standard that I'm working on implementing at the utility company that I work for, they are focused on increasing public safety, co-worker safety, and emergency responder safety. So I've had the benefit of having worked and seen similar systems in other industries. So what is a pipeline safety management system? It's API 1173. It's American Petroleum Institute. It's a recommended practice. And basically, the AGA has voluntarily committed to implementing this standard. And I'm going to talk to some of these things, but I'm not going to hit all the bullet points that you've hit before. But as in the incident with my cousin, some of those implements, and I'm going to flip back just so I don't lose my place, but some of those elements that we're implementing, when you look at the incident with my cousin, I mentioned it was a memorial race. And what that means is someone had died at that race the year before. And so if the people that had run that track had taken the time to learn from a prior incident, perhaps my cousin would have been injured that day. And those same rules and standards apply really to any type of industry, and that's what we're hoping to use in the utility company I work for, is applying things that happen elsewhere so that we learn from things that happen at other companies and other utility companies across the world, really. Secondly, other types of things that tie in from the event and the accident that hurt my cousin, I mentioned that orange fence, and I call it kind of a metaphorical orange fence, because to a 3-year-old child, that appeared to be a safety barrier, but clearly, as an adult with an engineering degree, I know that was what we would call an inadequate safeguard. And really that's part of what the standard calls the industry to do, is to look for those things that appear to be protecting the public and protecting our customers and our coworkers, but really aren't. So looking for that risk mitigation and trying to mitigate that. I'm going to try to avoid reading these elements to you, but I'm going to tie them into where they apply in incidences that have happened across the country and really what inspired this standard. So the event that is pictured behind me is what inspired the creation of this standard. The standard was released approximately 4 years ago. And this is San Bruno. It's an event that happens, it's a line rupture event that happened in San Bruno, California. And according to the National Transportation Safety Board report, which is the governing body that investigates catastrophic incidences like this, whether it happens in the chemical industry, the oil industry, they're the governing body that does those investigations. The following factors contributed to this catastrophic accident. So what happened in this event is the company was doing some tests with their control system, and the backup power for that failed, and it allowed the line to go to its maximum allowable operating pressure, which should not have been a problem. And unfortunately, in this scenario, it was, because the documentation of the records for that particular line were inaccurate, and it actually caused the line to overpressure. And so it went above the specification, even though it showed that it should have been okay. Secondly, the construction standards at the time, when it was put in the 1950s, when it was put in, when they did the investigation and they analyzed what was left of that pipe in that section that went, they found that it wasn't put into the standards of that day and time. And finally, one of the other elements, so these all kind of go into different elements. So documentation of records is an element, and there's a lot of focus in that we're working on, and all the companies that are implementing the standard are working on. Construction oversight is another element. Emergency response is an element. And in this particular case, the utility company that was responding, they actually responded fairly quickly. They were there within an hour and they had the gas shut off. The issue is the employees that were qualified that responded heard about it through the media coverage, not through the company that they were working for. And so really what that emergency response preparedness element calls the utility industry to do is to ensure that if in the event a worst case event happens, that we're as prepared as possible and we can do what we need to do and to minimize the events that are happening. Really, every type of energy system has risks. There's no energy system out there that doesn't have risks that have to be managed and mitigated. And what this standard does is it helps minimize those. So there's a before picture, an after picture, and a during picture. So it's a little bit out of order, but there was, I believe, close to 8 people that lost their lives in that incident. And I think it was close to 60 or 70 homes that were torched. So in my cousin's element, kind of bouncing back and forth a little bit, but going to the emergency response element, when we were there waiting, it seemed like it took a long time for the ambulance to get there. We were out in the country and it was rural. And you think about it today, when you go to a football game, there's the ambulance is sitting there because people understand that that's important. They've thought about it and prepared. That's really the same type of thing with the emergency response element. It's not having the ambulance there, but trying to think of everything that could go wrong and thinking through those improbable scenarios and having a backup plan in place. There's also an element called leadership and management commitment. And basically what that means is, and it's similar to the incident with the event with my cousin that, brain damaged him for life. He will never have a good short-term memory. He can't live on his own. If the owners of that track had reviewed their risks at that point in the track, perhaps he would not have been injured. And the previous owners had actually lost the track from the incident before, the event the year before. So it wasn't an unknown thing. And with my cousin, the health insurance company that he was covered by actually sued that track on his behalf, and it was closed shortly after that because it was, what is considered an organizational accident. There was a lot of things that were designed wrong. The track design in itself, only having 4 feet. If you've been to a race car race these days, there's generally, besides a much more sufficient barrier, there's several spaces, and that's intentional because you could have a car or a bike come through, and you can also have debris. So that protection of the crowd is pretty important. And in the industry that I work in, other types of, it's a similar nature is you have to have things designed properly. So the element that goes to that is operational controls. That being said, I really appreciate everyone being here and taking the time to listen. And if you're leaving here, there's a little bit of a take home that kind of does apply because the events that I showed you are a very rare occurrence. And that's why they're harder to work with, and that's why there's so many elements in that standard is it actually takes a lot more effort to prevent something that happens less frequently that has a higher consequence because you have to take through and you have to hold yourself to a higher standard to prevent that from ever occurring. Most of the things that happen in in our industry is people not realizing that there's a gas line there and actually hitting it. So about 40% of the events that we have are actually from people not planning that they're going to be digging and they don't call what's called a one-call number. So if you're at home and you're planning to dig, take the time to call because it is a serious consequence that you can put yourself in, and you're putting my coworkers potentially at risk if you don't, because they've got to come in and fix anything that is occurring. And in Illinois, that number is Julie or 811. The other part is if you have a gas leak or you think you have a gas leak, don't be scared to call. It's both the Julie number is free, as is if you think you have a gas leak at your home, calling the gas company to come out and check it. You're not going to be charged for that, and you shouldn't be afraid of calling us those gas troublemen are highly trained professionals, and they're not going to get upset about coming to check not just because it's their job, but they would much rather come out to your house and reassure you that there's nothing wrong and check it than be called because your home has exploded because you waited too long and you didn't recognize a problem. So on that note, I urge you to make sure you know, regardless of what type of energy system you're on, know where your energy meters are at, know what normal looks like, smells like, and sounds like, because those are all cues. So thank you again for your time today, and really appreciate the opportunity to share what I feel is my life's passion right now.